In a dusty Texas town, a wealthy rancher humiliated a poor boy by handing him the weakest, most broken horse anyone had ever seen. The crowd laughed, certain the boy would become a joke. But what no one expected was that inside those tired eyes burned the spirit of a champion. This is the story of Ethan and Rusty, the horse meant to be forgotten, but destined to change everything. The summer sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty streets of Willow Creek, a small Texas town where everyone seemed to know each other's business. That afternoon, the town square was buzzing with energy. The annual horse race was more than just a tradition. It was the highlight of the year, a chance for ranchers to show off their best horses and for the poor to gape in awe at animals worth more than their entire households. In the center of the commotion stood Charles Whitmore, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, a man with a reputation for cruelty masked by charm. His family had owned the Whitmore Ranch for generations, and in his eyes, he was the undisputed king of Willow Creek. Today, however, his eyes weren't fixed on the prize stallions lined up in the corral. They were locked on a boy. Ethan Miller, barely 17, stood awkwardly near the edge of the crowd. His boots were worn down, his shirt patched at the elbows, and his hands roughened from endless hours working odd jobs to help his mother. He had been dreaming of entering the race for 2 years, begging for a chance, but with no horse of his own, he was always laughed off. Until now. "Ethan!" Charles's booming voice carried across the square. The crowd parted as he strutted forward, his hat tilted just enough to show a smug smile. Behind him, a ranch hand tugged along a horse so frail and ragged that gasps rose from the onlookers, the animal's ribs pressed against its dull chestnut coat, its mane tangled and gray, one hind leg dragging as if each step was a burden. "This here is for you, son," Charles announced, clapping Ethan on the shoulder hard enough to nearly knock him off balance. "Now you can finally race with the rest of us." His laughter erupted, echoed by others who picked up on the mockery. The boy's cheeks flushed crimson. Around him, men slapped their knees, women whispered, children pointed. To them, this was entertainment, watching the poor boy humiliated under the sun. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, fighting the urge to turn and run. The horse, however, lifted its head with surprising dignity. Its large, sorrowful eyes met Ethan's, and for a brief, almost mystical moment, the noise of the crowd faded. In that gaze, Ethan saw something he didn't expect: defiance, pride, and an echo of strength long buried, but not gone. "Thank you, mister." "Whitmore," Ethan said, his voice shaky but firm. The crowd roared with more laughter at the absurdity of gratitude. Charles smirked and waved him off. "That bag of bones is good for nothing," he sneered. "You'll be lucky if it makes it to the starting line before collapsing." Ethan reached for the rope tied around the horse's neck. His hand trembled as his fingers brushed the animal's coat. It was coarse, warm, and trembling. Yet when he tugged gently, the horse followed him, each limping step a quiet act of resilience. From the edge of the square, a girl's eyes followed silently. Holly Whitmore, Charles's daughter, pressed her lips together, shame burning in her chest as she watched her father's cruelty. Her gaze shifted to the horse. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but she said nothing, retreating into the crowd before anyone could notice. As Ethan led the horse away, the voices behind him rang with mockery. "He'll never make it past the first turn. That thing belongs in the glue factory, not on the track. Poor kid. Guess humiliation runs in his family." Each word cut deep, But Ethan kept walking, shoulders squared against the storm of ridicule. Dust rose around his boots, clinging to his shirt, his skin, his pride. The horse stumbled, nearly collapsing, but Ethan steadied it, whispering under his breath, words only the animal could hear. "You're not done yet," he murmured. "Not while I'm here." The town laughed louder, but Ethan didn't look back. For him, and for the broken creature beside him, a bond had been sealed in that moment, a bond that neither the jeers of men nor the weight of poverty could undo. As the sun sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows across Willow Creek, Ethan led the horse out of sight, toward the humble shack he called home. Behind him, Charles Whitmore stood tall, certain he had turned the boy into a spectacle. He didn't know that what he had just set in motion would change everything. For Ethan, for his daughter, and for the entire town. Because sometimes, the cruelest gifts are the ones that awaken miracles. The shack where Ethan lived with his mother sat on the edge of Willow Creek, where the paved roads gave way to dirt tracks and mesquite bushes stretched in every direction. The house leaned slightly to one side, patched together with weathered wood and tin, but it was home. As the boy led the horse closer, the setting sun painted both of them in hues of gold and copper, as if trying to disguise the bruises of poverty. His mother, Margaret Miller, stepped out of the doorway, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. Her hair, once auburn, was streaked with gray, tied back in a bun that looked as tired as she did. She froze when she saw the animal tethered beside her son. "Lord, Ethan," she whispered, "where on earth did you get that poor thing?" "Mr. Whitmore gave him to me," Ethan replied quietly, keeping his voice steady. He expected her to be proud, but Margaret's expression darkened. "Gave?" Her tone dripped with disbelief. "Boy, that man doesn't give without reason. That's no gift, Ethan. That's a humiliation served on a silver platter." Ethan flinched, but instead of arguing, he stroked the horse's neck. The animal's coat was dull, and dust clung to it like a second skin. Yet when Ethan's hand moved along its side, the horse's breathing slowed, almost as if soothed by the touch. "Look at his eyes, Mama," Ethan said softly. "He's still got fight left in him. You just have to see it." Margaret shook her head, the lines on her face deepening. "What I see is a broken-down creature that should be resting, not dragged into a race to make a fool out of you. Ethan, please, don't let Whitmore use you this way." But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. He crouched to examine the horse's legs. The right hind one bore an old scar, jagged and pale against the dark chestnut hair. The mark looked deliberate, like the trace of an old injury from the track. As he leaned closer, he noticed faint numbers branded under the mane near the withers, numbers almost too faded to read. He frowned. Those weren't the marks of a farm horse. Those were the marks of a racer. "Rusty," Ethan murmured, testing the name that popped into his head. The horse flicked its ears and lifted its head, as if acknowledging the sound. For a heartbeat, boy and beast locked eyes again. Ethan swore there was something intelligent there, something that spoke louder than words. The night crept in, wrapping the shack in cool darkness. Ethan found scraps of wood and rigged a crude shelter beside the house. The roof leaked, the boards groaned, but it was enough to keep Rusty safe from the dew. He used the last of his money to buy a bag of feed from old Mister. Harlan's store, grain mixed with hay swept from the floor, hardly fit for champions, but it was all he could afford. As the horse ate slowly, Ethan sat cross-legged in the dirt, watching. He thought about the jeers in town, the look of contempt on Charles Whitmore's face. Most of all, he thought about the horse's eyes that had stared back at him with something more than mere animal instinct. Margaret brought out a lantern and set it near her son. The warm glow lit her face with sorrow and love. She crouched beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've always been this way," she said quietly. "Since you were little, finding wounded birds, stray dogs, and nursing them back when everyone else said it was hopeless. I'm proud of your heart, Ethan. But this—" Her voice faltered as she glanced at Rusty. "This is bigger than you. Don't let your kindness turn into your ruin." Ethan leaned into her touch, but didn't answer. Deep inside, he already knew he wouldn't abandon the horse. From the dark edge of the road, footsteps shuffled in the dust. An old man appeared, his frame stooped but steady, his hat brim shadowing a weathered face lined with decades of sun. He carried a walking stick, carved from mesquite wood, and moved with the slow assurance of someone who had nothing left to prove. "Evening," the man called, his voice gravelly but strong. "I couldn't help noticing that horse you brought home." Ethan stood quickly, defensive. "Who's asking?" The man tipped his hat. "Name's Sam Collins. Used to ride a few races around here a long time ago. Mind if I take a closer look?" Margaret hesitated, but Ethan nodded reluctantly. Sam stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. He studied Rusty with eyes sharp as a hawk's, running his hand gently along the horse's scarred leg, lifting the hoof with practiced ease. His lips pursed, and a flicker of recognition passed over his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered under his breath. "I thought I'd never see this horse again." Ethan's heart pounded. "You know him?" Sam straightened, his gaze meeting Ethan's. "Not as Rusty. I knew him as Storm Dancer. Fastest thing I ever saw on 4 legs. 5 years back, he was the pride of this county, belonged to a woman who loved him more than anything. After she passed, the horse disappeared. Folks said he was sold off, maybe even dead." He shook his head slowly. "But here he is, standing in your yard." The boy felt the ground tilt beneath him. Could it be true? Was this pathetic, limping creature really a legend fallen from grace? He looked at Rusty, Storm Dancer, and saw not just bones and scars, but the faint shadow of greatness hidden beneath the grime. Margaret drew in a sharp breath. "Are you telling me this ragged animal was once a champion?" Sam nodded. "Not just a champion. The kind of horse people tell stories about. I don't know what he's been through, but it wasn't kindness. He's been abandoned, worked hard, maybe starved. But his spirit, I can still see it burning in those eyes." Ethan touched Rusty's muzzle again, and the horse leaned into his palm. For the first time that day, Ethan allowed himself to smile. "If he still has fight," Ethan whispered, "then so do I." Sam's gaze softened. "Careful, boy. Believing in a horse like this can change your life, for better or worse. The question is, do you have the heart to see it through?" The lantern light flickered, shadows dancing across the shack. In that fragile glow, the bond between a broken boy and a forgotten champion began to take root. Neither Ethan nor Rusty knew the storm they were walking into, but one thing was certain. From this night forward, neither of them would walk alone. The following morning dawned hot and dry, as if the Texas sun was determined to squeeze every drop of strength out of the land. Ethan rose before the first light, stirred not by duty, but by the restless thought that something about Rusty, or Storm Dancer, as Sam Collins had called him, didn't add up. He stepped outside to find the horse standing beneath the crooked shelter he had built, eyes half closed yet alert, ears flicking at the faint buzz of cicadas. Margaret was already awake, kneading dough in the kitchen, her hands moving with mechanical precision. She barely looked up when Ethan filled a bucket with water and carried it to Rusty. But when the horse lowered his head to drink, Margaret spoke softly, almost to herself. "That old man last night, he said that horse was a champion." Ethan hesitated. "Yeah, he called him Storm Dancer." She stopped kneading, her shoulders tightening. Storm Dancer belonged to Eliza Whitmore. Everyone knew about that horse. Your daddy used to talk about him like he was some kind of miracle. After she passed, the horse vanished. Folks whispered that Charles couldn't stand the sight of him. Ethan blinked. "Wait, you're saying this horse really was theirs?" Margaret's face clouded with worry. "If it's true, then the Whitmores gave him to you for a reason, and I don't trust any reason Charles Whitmore has." Before Ethan could answer, a shadow fell across the yard. Sam Collins leaned against the fence, his hat pulled low, but his eyes sharp. "Mind if I come in?" he called. Ethan waved him over, and Sam stepped through the creaking gate. He carried a small tin of salve and a bundle of herbs tied with twine. "Figured your horse could use these. He's got old injuries, but sometimes old tricks still work better than new medicine." Ethan took the items with gratitude. "Thank you, sir." Sam squatted near Rusty, inspecting the scarred leg with patient hands. The horse shifted uneasily, but Sam murmured something low and soothing, words that sounded like secrets from another time. Rusty stilled, allowing the old man to prod and rub. "You see these scars?" Sam said, pointing. "These weren't from farm work. These are racing scars, burns from the track, marks from shoes fitted too tight, maybe even a fall. I'd stake my name on it. This horse was Storm Dancer." Ethan's heart thudded. "So it's true." Sam nodded grimly. "But truth can be a dangerous thing, boy. If people find out you've got Storm Dancer, they'll want to control him, or worse, make sure he never runs again. Some secrets are buried for a reason." Margaret wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and stepped outside. "Mr. Collins, if this horse belonged to the Whitmores, why would Charles give him to my son? Why humiliate Ethan in front of everyone?" Sam's eyes darkened. "Because to Charles, the horse is nothing but a reminder of what he lost. Eliza loved Storm Dancer more than any creature on this earth. After she passed, Charles couldn't bear it. I reckon he'd rather see the horse destroyed than cared for by someone else. Giving him to Ethan was his way of making a joke out of sorrow." The words sank heavy into the air. Ethan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening with anger. "That's not right. He doesn't deserve to decide Rusty's fate. If this horse was Eliza's, then he deserves better than being thrown away." Sam gave a slow nod, admiration flickering in his eyes. "You've got your mother's fire." "But fire burns, Ethan. You need to think carefully. This horse isn't just an animal anymore. He's a symbol, and symbols can start wars." Rusty nudged Ethan's shoulder, as if in agreement. The boy rested his forehead against the horse's muzzle, breathing in the earthy scent of hay and sweat. In that moment, Ethan made a silent vow. He would protect Rusty no matter the cost. Later that day, Ethan rode into town to fetch supplies. The streets buzzed with gossip, whispers trailing him like dust in the wind. He caught fragments of conversation, bets being placed on how quickly he would fail, jokes about how Whitmore had found the perfect clown for the race. At the general store, old Mister. Harlan leaned across the counter. "Boy, I heard you're setting yourself up for trouble." That horse ain't fit for anything but pulling a plow." Ethan forced a smile. "Maybe he's got more left in him than folks think." Mr. Harlan snorted, but lowered his voice. "Careful, Ethan. Whitmore's pride is a dangerous thing. If you embarrass him, he'll make you pay." On the way home, Ethan's thoughts churned. He felt the weight of every eye in town, every whisper echoing in his ears. Still, when he returned to the shack and saw Rusty raise his head to greet him, he knew there was no turning back. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in the dirt beside Rusty's shelter, listening to the cicadas sing under the stars. He ran his fingers along the horse's scarred leg, feeling the heat of old pain beneath the skin. Rusty shifted, lowering his head until it rested gently against Ethan's shoulder. "I don't care what they say," Ethan whispered. "You're not done. You're not just a joke. I'll prove it. We'll prove it together." From the doorway, Margaret watched silently, torn between fear and pride. In the faint glow of the lantern, she saw not just her son and a broken horse, but two souls bound by wounds deeper than flesh. She whispered a prayer that the vow Ethan had made would not destroy him. And somewhere deep inside Rusty's weary frame, a spark flickered, faint but alive, like an ember refusing to die. The following week rolled in with the kind of relentless heat that made the dust shimmer along the back roads of Willow Creek. Ethan spent every spare moment tending to Rusty, brushing out his tangled mane, massaging his injured leg with the salve Sam had given him, and speaking to him in a low voice, as if words alone could carry healing. Margaret watched with a mixture of worry and resignation, often standing in the doorway, her arms crossed as though she might shield her son from the consequences of his own stubborn hope. One evening, after Ethan had returned from hauling crates at the depot, he found a figure waiting by the fence. At first, his heart leapt into his throat. Charles Whitmore's men sometimes came by to collect rent, and he feared trouble. But when the figure turned, the lantern light caught the delicate features of Holly Whitmore. She clutched a burlap sack close to her chest and looked around nervously before approaching. "Holly?" Ethan whispered, stunned. "What are you doing here?" She slipped past the gate before he could stop her, her boots sinking into the dirt of the yard. "I had to see him," she said softly, her eyes already fixed on Rusty. The horse lifted his head, and something passed between them, recognition that cut through the silence of the night. "You know this horse," Ethan said, realization dawning. Holly nodded, her lips trembling. "He was my mother's." Storm Dancer. She adored him. When she was sick, she would spend hours in the stable, talking to him, brushing his coat, whispering things she never told anyone else. After she passed, her voice faltered. My father couldn't stand to look at him. He said the horse was cursed, that it brought back the pain. One day, Storm Dancer was just gone. Father told me he'd sold him to a man in another county. I believed him, until I saw him in the square last week. Ethan's chest tightened. "He gave him to me as a joke." "I know," Holly said, lowering her gaze. "That's why I'm here. I can't let my father's cruelty be the end of him." She opened the burlap sack, revealing bottles of liniment, packets of vitamins, and rolls of clean bandages. "These are from the ranch's supply. If anyone asks, you didn't get them from me." Ethan stared at the items, then at her. "Why are you helping me?" "If your father finds out, because I promised my mother," she interrupted, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "On her last night, she made me swear to look after Storm Dancer. I was young, I was weak, and I let him disappear without fighting. I won't fail him again." Rusty stepped forward, pressing his muzzle gently against Holly's shoulder. She let out a broken laugh and stroked his neck. "He remembers," she whispered. After all this time, he remembers me. They worked together under the dim lantern glow. Holly showed Ethan how to rub the liniment into the horse's swollen joints, how to mix the vitamins with grain, and how to use the bandages to support the weaker leg. Her hands were steady, practiced. Ethan watched in awe, realizing she knew more about horses than most men in town. "You're good at this," he said quietly. "My mother taught me everything," Holly replied. She used to say a horse isn't just muscle and bone, it's spirit. And spirit needs care, the same as flesh. For the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of something more than gratitude. It was dangerous, this spark that leapt between them, but he couldn't deny it. He saw it in her eyes too, though neither of them dared speak it aloud. When the work was done, Holly pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I have to go before anyone notices I'm gone," she said. "I'll come back when I can." Ethan walked her to the gate, his heart heavy with unspoken words. She paused before slipping into the shadows. "Take care of him, Ethan." He was meant for more than this town's laughter. After she left, Ethan returned to Rusty's side. The horse stood taller now, his coat shining faintly in the moonlight, his eyes brighter than they had been in weeks. Ethan ran a hand along his neck and whispered, "You're not alone anymore." Neither of us, our days turned into nights, and Holly returned whenever she could. She brought herbs her mother had once used, special brushes, even old tack hidden in the loft of the Whitmore stables. Together, she and Ethan cared for Rusty in secret, each visit binding them closer, not just to the horse, but to each other. But secrecy had its price. One evening, as Holly slipped away from the Miller shack, a pair of eyes watched from the shadows near the road. A ranch hand loyal to Charles narrowed his gaze, suspicion flickering like a match about to catch fire. He said nothing yet, but the seed of betrayal had been planted. Back at the shack, Ethan sat beside Rusty with the quiet certainty that something bigger was unfolding, something that stretched beyond a poor boy and a broken horse. He couldn't explain it, but he felt it in his bones. Rusty's story wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption, for the horse, for Holly, maybe even for himself. And though the world outside was waiting to laugh at their failure, here in the silent dark, a fragile alliance was forming, strong enough to defy the cruelty of men like Charles Whitmore. July stretched on in waves of heat, each day hotter than the last, until even the cicadas seemed to complain with their endless cries. The little shack creaked under the weight of the sun, and Ethan rose each morning with dust on his tongue and determination in his chest. Rusty, storm dancer, was improving. His ribs no longer jutted out quite so sharply. His coat had begun to shine beneath the brush, and there was a steadiness in his stride that hadn't been there weeks before. But the boy knew the real test was yet to come. He had no illusions. The horse was still thin, still marked by age and neglect. And though Holly's medicine and Sam's salves were working, Rusty remained fragile. Yet every time Ethan looked into those eyes, he saw something unbroken. It was the same stubborn spark he felt in himself, the refusal to be defined by hardship. That was why he pressed forward, even when reason told him to quit. One sweltering afternoon, Ethan led Rusty to the open patch of dirt behind the shack. He had fashioned a makeshift training ground by marking a rough circle with stones. It was crude, but it was all he had. He tried to get Rusty to trot, but the horse limped heavily after only a few steps. Ethan's heart clenched as the animal faltered, sweat dripping from his thin frame. "Easy, boy," Ethan whispered, steadying him. He knew he couldn't push too hard. Yet doubt gnawed at him. How could Rusty ever run in a real race if he couldn't even make it around a circle? That night, a storm rolled in without warning. Black clouds gathered, and the air grew thick with the metallic taste of lightning. Margaret urged Ethan inside, but he refused, running out to the shelter where Rusty stood trembling. The wind howled, rattling the tin roof until it tore loose, crashing into the yard. Rain poured down, soaking the horse and the boy alike. Rusty shuddered violently, his injured leg slipping in the mud. Ethan threw his arms around the horse's neck, pressing his face into the damp mane. "I won't leave you," he cried above the roar of the storm. "Not now. Not ever." The storm raged through the night, but Ethan stayed with Rusty, shielding him as best he could, whispering words that had no power against the wind, but carried weight in the heart of the horse. When dawn broke, the yard was a mess of broken boards and debris, but Rusty still stood, leaning gently into Ethan's side. By morning, Sam Collins appeared, his boots sinking into the mud as he surveyed the damage. "Well, looks like you passed your first real test," he said gruffly. "Storms have a way of showing who's got grit." He eyed the horse carefully. "And that animal's got more grit than I thought." Ethan nodded, exhausted but unyielding. He didn't give up. "Neither will I." Sam gave a slow smile, rare and fleeting. "Then we'll start training proper. But you need to know, this ain't just about strength, it's about trust. You can't ask a horse to give you everything unless he believes you'll give him the same." So training began in earnest. Sam showed Ethan how to ride light, how to guide with the knees instead of pulling hard on the reins. Holly slipped away from her father's ranch whenever she could, teaching Ethan tricks her mother had passed down, ways to calm a horse with touch, how to use rhythm in your voice to steady their nerves. Together, under the relentless Texas sun, the boy, the girl, and the old cowboy began shaping Rusty into something more than a relic. But the world outside their small circle wasn't blind. Word of Ethan's determination spread through town like wildfire. At the saloon, men laughed over mugs of beer, placing bets not on whether Rusty would win, but on how quickly he'd fail. Some claimed the horse wouldn't even make it out of the gate. Others joked Ethan would be thrown before the first turn. The laughter was cruel, but it carried a sting that reached Ethan's ears every time he ventured into town for supplies. One evening, after a long day of training, Ethan sat on the porch with Margaret. She watched him silently, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Finally, she spoke. "Ethan, I can't stop you. I know that. But promise me one thing. Don't lose yourself in trying to prove something to those people. They'll never care about you the way that horse does." Ethan met her gaze, his throat tight. "I'm not doing it for them, Mama. I'm doing it for him. And maybe for me too." That night, when Ethan returned to Rusty's side, he noticed something different. The horse stood taller, his ears pricked forward, his eyes bright even in the dim light. Ethan brushed him down slowly, the rhythm of the strokes calming them both. The storm had tested them, but they had endured. As he leaned against Rusty's warm side, Ethan whispered, "We're not just surviving anymore. We're getting ready. One day, they'll see what I see." The cicadas droned, the stars glittered above, and in that fragile stillness, a boy and his horse carried the weight of a dream that no storm could wash away. By late August, the air in Willow Creek carried the thick scent of dust and mesquite smoke. Every porch in town buzzed with gossip about the upcoming race, and every conversation seemed to include Ethan Miller's name. Some spoke with mockery, others with pity, but none with faith. In the saloon, Men raised their glasses and roared with laughter at the idea of a ragged horse competing against the polished stallions of the county. Even children in the street mimicked Ethan, limping like Rusty and braying like mules. Ethan bore it all in silence. Each morning, he rose before dawn, feeding Rusty with what little grain he could afford, then working him slowly around the makeshift corral. Sam Collins would appear from time to time, offering stern advice. Holly slipped in quietly when she could, bringing fresh bandages and medicine hidden beneath her shawl. Together they coaxed Rusty into trotting longer distances, strengthening the leg that once dragged hopelessly through the dirt. But as Rusty grew stronger, so did the hostility of the town. One evening, Ethan walked home from the depot with a week's wages in his pocket, only to find 3 men waiting in the shadows of the alley. They weren't strangers, ranch hands from Bill Turner's spread, men with whiskey on their breath and mischief in their eyes. "Evening, Miller," one drawled. "Heard you're fixing to make a fool of yourself in the race." Ethan stiffened, his fists clenching. "I'm not looking for trouble." "Good," another sneered, stepping closer. "Then take our advice. Don't ride. Mr. Turner's willing to pay you more than you'll make in a year if you stay home that day. $500. That's enough to fix your roof, feed your mama, and buy you a real horse someday." The offer hung in the air, tempting in its weight. Ethan thought of Margaret's weary face, the cracks in the walls of their shack, the nights he'd gone hungry so his mother could eat. $500 was more than survival. It was a lifeline. But when he pictured Rusty's eyes, proud even in weakness, the decision was clear. Ethan shook his head. "No deal. He deserves his chance." The men exchanged glances, then laughed harshly. "Suit yourself. Don't say we didn't warn you." One shoved him hard against the wall before they disappeared into the night. Ethan staggered, but didn't fall. He walked home bruised, but his resolve burned brighter than ever. When he told Sam about the encounter, the old cowboy nodded knowingly. "Turner's got a lot to lose if Whitmore's horse shows he still has spirit. Men like Turner bet on control, not hope. You crossed him by saying no. Be careful." Ethan lowered his gaze. "I couldn't take the money." It would have meant betraying Rusty. Sam clapped him on the shoulder. "That's what makes you different, boy. Don't let them break that in you." But threats didn't only come from Turner's men. A week later, Charles Whitmore himself appeared at the Miller shack, dressed immaculately despite the dust. His shadow stretched across the yard as he leaned against the fence, his smile cold and calculated. Rusty whinnied softly, his ears flattening. "Nice little project you've got there, Ethan," Charles said smoothly. "Heard you've been wasting your pay on medicines and feed. All for this broken-down nag." He tilted his head, studying the horse as though appraising scrap metal. "You do realize, boy, that horse isn't worth the dirt under your boots." Ethan swallowed hard. "He's worth more than you think." Charles's smile vanished. "Careful, son. You live on my land. That roof over your head, the ground under your feet, it's mine. And I don't take kindly to being mocked. When you drag that horse into the race, you'll make me the laughingstock of this county." "I'm not mocking you," Ethan replied quietly. "I'm just giving him a chance." "A chance?" Charles's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "That horse is a ghost. My wife clung to him when she should have let go. After she died, I swore I'd never look at him again. And now you parade him around as if he means something. Let me be clear. If you bring him to that race, you'll regret it." Margaret stepped out of the shack then, her face pale, but resolute. "That's enough, mister." "Whitmore." You've had your say. Now leave my boy alone. For a moment, Charles's eyes flicked to her, then back to Ethan. A smirk twisted his lips. Strong words for a woman living under my roof. Remember who holds the deeds, Mrs. Miller. Don't push your luck. With that, he turned sharply and strode away, his boots kicking up dust. Ethan's hands shook as he reached for Rusty's mane. He can threaten all he wants. I'm not backing down. Margaret laid a trembling hand on her son's shoulder. Just promise me you'll be careful. Pride is one thing, Ethan, but survival is another. That night, Ethan sat outside with Rusty, brushing his coat until it gleamed faintly under the moonlight. He thought of Turner's offer, of Whitmore's threats, of the laughter that followed him everywhere. The world seemed to conspire against him, pressing him to surrender. But when Rusty lowered his head and nudged Ethan's chest with his muzzle, the boy closed his eyes and whispered, "We're in this together. No matter what it costs." Above them, the stars stretched wide across the Texas sky, silent witnesses to a vow no amount of money or power could break. And though the night was still, Ethan felt the storm gathering, silent, dangerous, and inevitable. September arrived with cooler mornings, though the Texas sun still baked the earth by midday. Ethan rose before dawn each day, the call of cicadas fading into the low knickers of Rusty waiting for him by the makeshift corral. The boy's hands had grown tougher from work, his shoulders broader from lifting and hauling, but it was the steady fire in his eyes that showed the change most clearly. He was no longer the boy who had been laughed at in the town square. He was something else now, shaped by duty, by loyalty, and by the weight of a promise he refused to break. Sam Collins began coming by almost every day, sometimes with a bag of herbs, other times with nothing but his gravelly voice and sharp eyes. The old cowboy rarely wasted words, but when he spoke, Ethan listened as if the world depended on it. "Riding a horse like Rusty isn't about force," Sam explained one morning, tossing Ethan an old leather bridle that had seen better days. "It's about trust. You pull too hard on those reins, you'll break him. You listen too little, and he'll never give you his best. You've got to learn to feel his rhythm, like you're part of him." Ethan nodded, slipping the bridle onto Rusty. The horse tossed his head stubbornly, but Ethan stroked his neck, whispering until the tension eased. Slowly, they began moving around the corral, Ethan's hands light, his body swaying with the horse's uneven gait. At first it was awkward, jerky, filled with missteps, but Sam watched without interrupting, his weathered face unreadable. "Again," Sam barked after a few laps. So Ethan tried again, and again, until sweat soaked his shirt, and Rusty's sides glistened under the sun. At last, Sam gave a short nod. "Better. You're learning to ride with him instead of on him. That's the difference between a rider and a master." The lessons weren't just physical. In the evenings, Sam would sit on the porch, a cigarette glowing faintly between his fingers, and tell stories of horses he had known, champions who had risen from nothing, and others who had been broken by men too proud to listen. "You can heal a horse's body," Sam said one night, his voice low. "But if you don't heal his spirit, you've got nothing but muscle and bone. Storm Dancer's spirit was wounded the day your mama's friend Eliza passed, and Charles Whitmore, he made sure the wound festered. It'll take more than medicine to bring him back." Ethan glanced at Rusty, who dozed nearby with his head low, and whispered, "I'll bring him back. I swear it." Sam studied him for a long moment, then chuckled softly. "You remind me of myself when I was young. Stubborn as a mule, too hard-headed to quit. Maybe that's what it takes. Holly continued her secret visits, slipping through the shadows with supplies and quiet encouragement. Sometimes she brought tack hidden in bundles of laundry. Other times she smuggled out jars of the Whitmore Ranch's finest feed. She also carried memories, stories of her mother brushing Storm Dancer until his coat shone, of whispered conversations in the stable where her mother swore the horse understood every word. Those memories gave Ethan strength, turning his dream into something more sacred than pride. But training was not without setbacks. One afternoon, as Ethan urged Rusty into a slow canter, the horse stumbled hard, nearly throwing him. Ethan hit the dirt with a bone-jarring thud, the taste of earth filling his mouth. Rusty whinnied sharply, his injured leg trembling. Panic clawed at Ethan's chest as he scrambled up, fear burning that the horse had undone weeks of progress. Sam was at his side in an instant, kneeling to examine the leg. After a tense silence, the old man grunted. "Not broken. Just strained. He'll be sore for a few days." Ethan exhaled, shakily, resting his forehead against Rusty's damp coat. "I thought we lost it. I thought he was finished." Sam's hand landed firm on his shoulder. "That's the thing about horses, and about life. They stumble. We all stumble. What matters is getting back up again." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. For the next week, he walked Rusty gently, letting him heal, whispering encouragement with every step. The setback only deepened their bond. By the time Rusty was strong enough to trot again, the horse followed Ethan's commands with a loyalty that startled even Sam. But not everyone was pleased with their progress. Rumors spread that Whitmore's daughter had been seen near the Miller shack, whispers that made their way back to Charles himself. His temper simmered, and though he said nothing outright, Ethan felt the tension whenever he passed through town. Men loyal to Whitmore muttered under their breath, and Ethan caught more than one suspicious eye following him. Still, he refused to bend. Each stride Rusty took was a victory, each lesson from Sam a step closer to redemption. Under the vast Texas sky, boy and horse moved as one, their shadows long in the evening light. And though the road ahead bristled with obstacles, Ethan believed, truly believed, that the bond they were building was stronger than fear. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Sam leaned on the fence, his gaze fixed on the boy guiding Rusty in slow circles. "You've got the makings of a rider, Ethan," he said at last. "Not just any rider. The kind that can turn a broken horse into a champion again." Ethan tightened his grip on the reins, determination blazing in his chest. "Then that's what I'll do." And for the first time since Storm Dancer had limped into his life, Ethan let himself believe that the impossible might just be within reach. The days grew shorter as autumn edged into Willow Creek, but the heat still lingered in the afternoons, heavy and oppressive. Ethan felt the weight of every passing day pressing down on him, as if time itself was daring him to give up before the race. Rusty was stronger now, his stride more certain, his coat beginning to glisten with the health that came from care and consistency. But every improvement seemed to invite more whispers from town, more laughter, more wagers made in smoky saloons where Ethan's name was the butt of every joke. One evening, Margaret found her son sitting on the porch, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze lost somewhere out in the distance. She dried her hands on her apron and sat beside him. "You're thinking about the race again," she said softly, though it was not a question. Ethan nodded. Everyone expects me to fail. They're placing bets not on whether I'll lose, but how badly. Part of me wonders if I should just walk away. Save Rusty, save you the shame. Margaret reached over and placed a hand over his. Her skin was rough from years of scrubbing floors and washing dishes, but her touch carried the kind of strength Ethan leaned on when his own began to waver. Ethan, I've seen you fight for every stray creature that's crossed your path. I've seen you stand up to boys twice your size when they mocked the weak. You were never meant to walk away. If you leave now, it won't be the town's laughter that haunts you. It'll be your own regret. Her words settled deep, and Ethan drew in a shaky breath. But if I lose, then you lose with honor, she said firmly. Better to stumble trying than to bow your head for money or pride. That horse believes in you, Ethan. Don't you dare let him down that night. Holly slipped into the yard under the cover of darkness. The cool air carried the scent of cedar and dust, and her shawl was pulled tight around her shoulders. Ethan was brushing Rusty when she appeared, her lantern casting a soft glow across the horse's flank. You're pushing him hard, she said quietly. Are you sure he's ready? Ethan met her eyes, weary but resolute. He's more ready than anyone knows. He just needs a chance. She set the lantern down and stepped closer, her fingers brushing Rusty's mane. My mother used to say that Storm Dancer could feel the heartbeat of the rider. He matched her mood. When she was calm, he was calm. When she was afraid, he carried her faster, as if to protect her. If that bond is still there, you don't have to push him. You just have to trust him. Ethan's throat tightened. Sometimes I think he trusts me more than I trust myself. Holly smiled faintly, sadness flickering in her eyes. Then learn to trust yourself too. For a moment, silence settled between them, broken only by Rusty's steady breathing. Then Holly reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched Ethan's arm. I need to tell you something. Ethan froze. What is it? She hesitated, her eyes shimmering in the lantern light. I promised my mother I would protect Storm Dancer. I failed him once. If my father finds out I've been here, helping you, he'll be furious. He might even drive you and your mother off his land. But I couldn't stay away. I couldn't let him rot in that field. I'm here because I believe in him. And in you. Ethan's chest ached with the weight of her words. He wanted to speak, to tell her what her faith meant to him, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he placed his hand gently over hers. Thank you, he whispered. Her eyes softened. Ethan, whatever happens tomorrow, know this. You've already given him back his dignity. No one can take that from you. As midnight approached, Holly left reluctantly, disappearing into the shadows of the dirt road. Ethan stood in the yard long after she was gone, watching the stars glitter cold and sharp above him. He turned back to Rusty, who was lying down in the shelter, his eyes half closed but alert. Ethan crouched beside him, running a hand over his mane. Tomorrow, they'll laugh. They'll say we don't belong there. But we'll show them, Rusty. We'll show them that even the broken can rise again. Rusty shifted, pressing his muzzle gently against Ethan's shoulder. The boy closed his eyes, letting the warmth of that gesture steady him. Sleep came late and fitful. Ethan lay awake on his thin mattress, listening to the night sounds, the call of owls, the rustle of leaves, the faint sigh of the wind. He thought of Holly's trembling confession, of his mother's fierce faith, of Sam's gruff lessons. Most of all, he thought of Rusty, waiting quietly in the dark, carrying scars that mirrored his own. Just before dawn, Ethan rose. He walked outside to the corral, where the first pale light of morning brushed the horizon. Rusty lifted his head, ears pricked, as if sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. Ethan reached for the rope and whispered, "It's time, old friend. Whatever happens, we face it together." The world around them was still, suspended in that fragile hour before the storm breaks. And in that silence, a boy and a battered horse stood on the threshold of a day that would change their lives forever. The morning of the race broke with a sky the color of pewter, the heavy clouds threatening rain but holding back just enough to let the anticipation build. Willow Creek had never looked so alive. From every dusty road, wagons rolled in, riders cantered down the hills, and townsfolk gathered along the wide red dirt track that circled the town, square and stretched into the open fields beyond. The smell of fried dough, tobacco smoke, and horse sweat mingled in the air, thick and intoxicating. Ethan walked Rusty down the narrow road toward the square, his boots caked in dust, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear little else. Rusty moved beside him with a deliberate gait, slower than the sleek horses already prancing at the line, but there was a dignity in his step that drew more than one skeptical glance. The boy's shirt clung to his back with sweat, and every whispered laugh from the crowd pressed heavier on his shoulders. As he approached the track, the jeers grew louder. "Look at that scarecrow and his nag," someone shouted. "Bet the boy don't make it past the first corner," another voice called, followed by raucous laughter. Ethan kept his head down, but his hand never left Rusty's mane. He whispered to the horse, words meant for no one else. "Don't listen to them. Just me. Just us." At the starting line, the contrast was almost cruel. To Ethan's left stood 3 magnificent stallions, muscles rippling beneath coats polished to a shine. Their riders sat tall, dressed in crisp shirts and gleaming boots, their saddles embroidered and reins decorated with silver buckles. And then there was Ethan, thin, in patched clothes, mounted on a horse whose ribs still showed faintly, whose scars spoke of years of hardship. Among the crowd, Sam Collins leaned against the fence, his hat pulled low, but his eyes burning with pride. Beside him, Margaret clutched her apron in white-knuckled fists, whispering prayers into the wind. And somewhere across the track, half hidden in the throng, Holly watched with her heart in her throat, her father standing only a few paces away with arms folded, his expression unreadable. The announcer raised a white flag. The crowd hushed, a sea of expectation. Ethan felt Rusty tense beneath him, every muscle taut, ears flicking back as though bracing for the sound of the world against him. The boy bent low, stroking the horse's neck. "Easy, boy. We don't have to beat them all. We just have to try. Riders ready," the announcer called. The crowd roared. Dust swirled in the air, and Ethan's heartbeat merged with the pounding of hooves beside him. "Go!" The flag dropped, and the world erupted. The other horses surged forward in a blur of power and speed, the thunder of their hooves rattling the ground. Rusty lurched into motion, his gait uneven at first, lagging behind as the crowd's laughter broke like a wave. "He can't even run straight," someone shouted. But Ethan held steady, refusing to push too hard, guiding Rusty gently into stride. They rounded the first corner far behind the pack, dust from the others stinging Ethan's eyes, the sound of mockery ringing in his ears. Still, he whispered encouragement, words carried by the wind to the ears of his battered horse. Halfway up the hill that wound past the church, Rusty faltered. His leg wobbled, and for one terrifying heartbeat, Ethan thought they would stop altogether. The crowd's laughter swelled. cruel and triumphant. But then Rusty lifted his head, his ears pricking forward as if catching some invisible call. He took another step, then another, the limp easing into a stride that grew steadier with each breath. Ethan leaned forward, his voice a whisper against the horse's ear. "That's it, boy. You're not done. Show them." By the time they reached the top of the hill, the other riders had pulled far ahead, their colorful shirts flashing against the gray sky. But Rusty's stride had smoothed into rhythm, his breathing strong, his eyes burning with something fierce. He was no longer stumbling. He was remembering. The descent back toward the fields was treacherous, the red dirt slick with the first drops of rain. One rider skidded, nearly losing his seat, curses flying as the crowd gasped. Rusty picked his way carefully at first, then, with Ethan's gentle urging, lengthened his stride into a canter that carried them faster, steadier. Dust and rain spattered Ethan's face, but for the first time, he smiled. The jeers had quieted. A murmur rippled through the crowd, disbelief threading into the voices that had mocked only moments before. "Look at him go," someone whispered. "They're still in it," another said, astonished. As they rounded back into the town square, the other riders still held the lead, but Rusty's head was high, his stride powerful, his limp nearly invisible. Ethan leaned low, feeling the rhythm of the horse beneath him, as if their hearts had found the same beat. The crowd erupted again, but this time it wasn't all laughter. Some clapped, some cheered, some simply stared in awe. Ethan heard none of it. All he felt was the rush of air against his face, the pounding of Rusty's hooves, and the surge of belief that maybe, just maybe, they weren't running toward humiliation, but toward something far greater. And though the race was far from over, the boy and his battered horse had already won a small victory. Against doubt, against ridicule, against the weight of despair. They were still running. And that, in itself, was enough to silence the storm for one fleeting, glorious moment. The red dirt clung to Ethan's skin as the race thundered on, every stride of the horses pounding like drums in the hearts of the crowd. Rusty was far behind the leaders now, his chestnut coat streaked with sweat, his breath coming in harsh bursts that misted in the cool air. From the stands, the laughter had softened to murmurs, a low tide of disbelief that he was still running at all. The boy leaned low over the horse's neck, his hands steady on the reins, his voice a constant whisper. "You're not alone, Rusty. We've come this far, just one step at a time." They were climbing again, the slope that wound past the cemetery on the hill. The other riders were mere flashes of color ahead, already cresting the rise. Ethan felt Rusty's legs falter, his stride shortening, his body trembling under the weight of exhaustion and pain. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of his uneven hooves and Ethan's own desperate heartbeat. Then, it happened. Rusty slowed to a near halt at the top of the hill, sides heaving, eyes clouded with fatigue. The crowd's voices swelled in a chorus of cruel delight. "He's finished," someone shouted. "Should have stayed home," another jeered. Ethan's throat burned with humiliation, but he didn't lift his head to meet the crowd. Instead, he pressed his cheek against Rusty's damp mane and whispered so only the horse could hear. "You don't have to do this for them. Do it for you. Do it for us." Rusty stood still for a breath, ears twitching, tail flicking. Then, as though some memory stirred within him, he lifted his head. His ears pricked forward, and his eyes sharpened with a light Ethan had never seen before. In that instant, Rusty was no longer a broken animal. He was Storm Dancer. The legend whispered about in barns and saloons, the horse that once ruled these very tracks. With a sudden surge, he lunged forward, his stride smoothing into something powerful, graceful, unstoppable. Ethan gasped, holding tight as the horse devoured the ground beneath them, each hoofbeat faster, stronger, as if time itself had turned back. The crowd fell silent, a hush of disbelief sweeping across the stands. Then came the first cries, astonished, breathless. "He's flying! It can't be! Look at him!" Rusty raced down the slope with a speed that defied everything they had seen. His legs moved in perfect rhythm, the limp gone, his body flowing with power as though every scar, every year of suffering had been burned away. Ethan bent low, his hands steady, tears pricking his eyes as he whispered, "That's it, boy. Remember who you are." By the time they reached the base of the hill, Rusty had caught up to the last of the riders. Dust sprayed as they surged past, the once mocking competitor casting a stunned glance as the battered horse overtook him. The roar of the crowd followed, not with laughter now, but with awe. They hit the long stretch by the river, the water glinting under the gray sky. Ethan urged nothing. He didn't need to. Rusty seemed to know the course by heart, his strides eating the distance as if guided by ghosts of the past. Another rider fell behind them, then another. The boy felt the thunder of hooves around him, but all he could see was the horse beneath him, transformed by faith into something greater than flesh and bone. "Storm Dancer," Ethan whispered, the name foreign and familiar all at once. Rusty's ears flicked back as if he heard, as if he understood, and then he surged faster, chasing the front with everything he had left. Ahead, the favorite of the race, Bill Turner's stallion, sleek and muscular, still held the lead. The rider cracked his whip, urging the animal to push harder, but Rusty was closing the gap. With every stride, the impossible became less impossible, until the battered horse and the boy were running side by side with the finest horse in the county. The crowd screamed now, voices breaking in disbelief and wild encouragement. Mothers clutched their children. Old men leaned over the fence with tears in their eyes. And even Sam Collins, usually silent and stoic, shouted hoarsely. Margaret stood frozen, her hands pressed to her lips, her prayers spilling out in gasps. Rusty's breath rasped, his body shuddering with the effort, but his spirit burned brighter than the pain. Ethan leaned low, his voice raw. "She's watching, boy. Holly's mother, your old friend. She's watching. Show her you're still the champion she believed in." It was as though the horse heard, as though the words reached into the core of him. Rusty gathered himself and surged forward with one final desperate burst of speed. The sound of the crowd fell away. All Ethan could hear was the wind in his ears, the pounding of hooves, the rhythm of his own heartbeat aligned perfectly with the horse beneath him. For a brief, shining moment, boy and horse were one. And in that unity, the impossible happened. Rusty pulled ahead. As they thundered into the final stretch, mud and dust spraying from the ground, Ethan closed his eyes for a single breath and whispered, "We believe, Rusty. We believe." The finish line loomed ahead, the crowd's roar rising like a wave ready to break. And though the outcome was still uncertain, though pain threatened to drag Rusty down at any second, the air itself seemed to tremble with the knowledge that faith had awakened something no one could deny. Rusty was no longer the town's joke. He was the storm returned, the fire reborn. And together, He and Ethan were rewriting destiny with every stride. The final stretch of the race stretched wide before them, a straightaway of red dirt bordered by shouting townsfolk pressed tight against the rails. The air quivered with dust and thunder, the crowd's roar swelling until it seemed the earth itself was trembling. Ethan leaned low over Rusty's neck, his fingers knotted in the coarse mane, his voice raw from whispers that had carried them this far. Ahead, Bill Turner's prized stallion thundered forward, muscles rippling, nostrils flaring with every breath. Its rider, face twisted with determination, swung the whip again and again, desperate to maintain the lead. For a moment it looked certain. This was the horse bred for speed, trained for victory, a creature sculpted for the very glory the crowd demanded. And beside it, battered and scarred, Rusty strained with every ounce of strength left in his aging frame. The stands shook with shouts. "He can't hold it," one man cried. "That old nag's gonna collapse." But then silence rippled through the throng, like a hush before a prayer. Rusty's stride lengthened, his hooves drumming the earth with the rhythm of remembered triumph. The limp that had mocked him for years was gone. In its place was a smooth, powerful motion, as if the spirit of Storm Dancer had risen from the grave. Ethan could feel the horse's body quiver beneath him, not with weakness, but with power straining to be free. He bent closer, his lips almost brushing Rusty's ear. "One last run, boy. One last storm." The horse answered with a surge so sudden Ethan nearly lost his balance. The crowd gasped as Rusty's head drew even with Turner's stallion, the two running neck and neck. Dust filled the air, stinging eyes and throats, but no one looked away. Every gaze was locked on the duel unfolding down the home stretch. Bill Turner's face contorted with fury. He shouted, cursed, and brought the whip down harder. His stallion snorted, muscles straining, eyes rolling with the force of command. But Rusty ran for something more than orders or pain. He ran for dignity, for memory, for the boy who had believed in him when no one else would. The crowd's roar fractured into cries of astonishment. "He's doing it!" someone shouted. "By God, he's passing him!" Sam Collins gripped the fence so hard his knuckles whitened, his old heart hammering in disbelief. Margaret stood frozen, tears streaming unchecked down her cheeks, her lips moving soundlessly in prayer. And Holly, hidden among the throng, pressed both hands to her chest, her eyes shining with the memory of her mother and the horse she had once called family. Step by step, stride by stride, Rusty edged ahead. Ethan could feel the strain in every shuddering breath, the pain hidden beneath the power. He wanted to pull back, to ease the weight, but he knew this was Rusty's choice. The horse wasn't running because he was forced to. He was running because he wanted to, because at last, someone had given him a reason. The finish line loomed, painted white against the trampled dirt. Time slowed. Ethan's heart pounded in rhythm with Rusty's hooves, each beat a drum of defiance. Turner's stallion lunged, stretching every muscle, but Rusty's ears flattened, his neck arched, and from deep within, he found a final burst of speed that carried them forward. The line passed in a blur, the sound of hooves giving way to an almost unbearable silence. For one suspended heartbeat, no one knew. The crowd stared, mouths open, bodies leaning forward as if pulled by the weight of the moment. Then the announcer's voice cracked through the stillness, high with disbelief. "Rusty takes it!" By a nose, Rusty wins! The silence shattered. The square erupted in chaos, cheers, cries, even sobs breaking like waves against the dusty air. Hats flew into the sky. Children screamed with joy. Men and women clutched each other as if to prove it was real. The horse they had mocked, the boy they had scorned, had done the impossible. Ethan slid from Rusty's back, his legs trembling so badly he nearly collapsed. His arms wrapped around the horse's neck, his face pressed against the sweat-soaked mane. Rusty's chest heaved, foam flecking his lips, his body quaking with exhaustion, but his eyes, those deep, defiant eyes, shone with fire. The crowd surged forward, people who had laughed at Ethan now reaching to touch Rusty, to claim a piece of the miracle. But Ethan held tight, shielding the horse as Sam pushed through, his voice rough with urgency. "Give him space! Let the animal breathe!" Margaret reached them next, her hands shaking as she cupped her son's face. "You did it, Ethan. You both did it." Her tears mingled with his sweat, her pride wrapping around him like a shield against all the scorn they had endured. Then came Holly, slipping past the crowd, her shawl falling from her shoulders. She pressed her hand against Rusty's neck, her eyes brimming with emotion. "You came back to us," she whispered, more to the horse than to the boy. Rusty turned his head, nuzzling her hand with a gentleness that broke her heart open. And finally, from the far edge of the crowd, Charles Whitmore stepped forward, the man who had mocked, who had discarded, who had turned grief into cruelty. His face was pale, his lips tight, but in his eyes there was something new. Shame, perhaps, or sorrow. The crowd parted for him, the noise dimming as anticipation thickened. Ethan stiffened, bracing for ridicule or threats, but when Charles stopped before them, he did not sneer. He reached out with a trembling hand, laying it gently on Rusty's heaving shoulder. His voice cracked, softer than the boy had ever heard it. "I was wrong." The words hung in the air, fragile as glass. The crowd hushed, the town itself holding its breath again. Charles swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "Forgive me. For him. For her. For all of it." Rusty stood tall, sweat dripping, sides quaking, but in that moment, he looked every bit the champion he once had been. And with the town watching, with the past pressing down like the weight of the sky, the horse answered not with words, but with the steady fire in his eyes. Ethan closed his own eyes, resting his forehead against Rusty's, his chest heaving with sobs he could no longer hold back. Around them, the town cheered. But in that circle of silence between boy and horse, between grief and forgiveness, something greater than victory had been born. Rusty had carried them all across a finish line none of them had ever dreamed possible. And Willow Creek would never forget the day the old nag became a legend once more. The dust of the race still hung in the air as the crowd pressed closer, their voices a tide of disbelief and exhilaration. For the first time in living memory, Willow Creek was united not in laughter or scorn, but in awe. They had witnessed a miracle. An old horse that should never have been able to finish had not only endured, but triumphed. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Miller, his arms wrapped around Rusty's neck, his face streaked with sweat and tears. But the roar of the crowd began to soften as Charles Whitmore stepped forward. The powerful rancher's broad shoulders seemed to sag beneath the weight of unseen burdens. His immaculate coat was dusted with red dirt, his hat tilted back enough to reveal eyes that had lost their sharp edge. There was no sneer, no triumph, only weariness. The crowd parted, their murmurs growing quiet. Ethan stood still, his heart hammering, uncertain what storm would break next. Rusty shifted beside him, ears flicking nervously as if he too sensed the tension. Charles stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the horse that had once been his wife's pride. For a long moment, he said nothing, his throat working as if the words were caught like stones. When at last he spoke, his voice was low, cracked, and stripped of the arrogance the town had always known. This horse, he was hers. His eyes flicked to Holly, who had edged closer, her face pale and resolute. Eliza loved him more than anything. She said he carried her heart when her body was too weak to bear the pain. Holly's breath hitched. I told you that. I begged you not to sell him. Charles's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his voice breaking. I couldn't bear it. After she passed, every time I looked at him, I saw her eyes. I saw her smile. I saw everything I lost. And I hated him for it. I thought if I erased him, I could erase the grief. His shoulders slumped, and the crowd leaned in, listening to every ragged word. So I threw him away. I threw away the last piece of her. Ethan stood frozen, the anger that had burned in him for weeks clashing with the sight of this broken man. He wanted to shout, to condemn, to demand why Rusty had suffered years of neglect because of Charles's weakness. But before he could speak, Holly's voice cut through the silence, sharp with pain. You didn't just throw him away. You threw away her memory. You turned love into shame. Her voice trembled but grew stronger. And you tried to bury it by mocking Ethan. By mocking what she loved. Charles closed his eyes, his face twisting with regret. You're right. I see it now. I see it clearer than I've ever seen anything. I hurt this horse, I hurt you, and I hurt myself. And for what? To avoid feeling what I should have faced years ago. He turned then, his gaze locking on Ethan. Boy, I wronged you most of all. I mocked you. I tried to humiliate you, when all you did was give him what I should have given from the start. Faith. For that, I owe you an apology. I owe him an apology. The square was silent. Men who had followed Charles's orders for years looked at one another uneasily. Women wiped at their eyes, touched by the rawness of a man they had only ever seen as unyielding. Even the children sensed something sacred unfolding in that moment. Charles stepped closer, reaching out a tentative hand. Rusty stiffened, but did not move away. His muzzle brushed the rancher's palm, and for the first time in years, Charles touched the horse not with disdain, but with reverence. His voice shook. I'm sorry, old friend. I should have cared for you. I should have honored her through you. Forgive me. Rusty stood still, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. In his dark, knowing eyes, there was no reproach. Only a calm that seemed to say the past was acknowledged, not forgotten. Ethan's throat tightened at the sight, his anger giving way to something he didn't expect. Pity. Sam Collins pushed forward through the crowd, his gravelly voice carrying. Takes a man to win a race, but it takes a greater man to admit when he's lost more than a race. Charles glanced at him, then back to Ethan. Let me make this right. Come work for me, train him, care for him as your own. I'll pay you fair, and I'll give you and your mother a home where you'll never have to fear eviction again. He swallowed, then added quietly, and teach me. Teach me how to care for him, how to carry her memory with dignity instead of burying it in shame. The offer struck Ethan like a blow. He had spent years despising this man, yet here was an opportunity he had never dared imagine. Security for his mother, freedom to care for Rusty, and a chance to honor Eliza Whitmore's love. Holly touched Ethan's arm, her eyes pleading. Say yes. Not for him. For her. For Storm Dancer. Ethan looked at Rusty, the horse that had carried him not just through the race, but through humiliation, despair, and fear. He saw in those eyes the same trust that had pulled them from the edge of defeat. Slowly, he nodded. I'll do it, he said, his voice steady. But only if I can do it my way. No more cruelty, no more shame, only care, only respect. Charles bowed his head, humbled. Your way then. The crowd erupted into cheers once more, not the wild frenzy of victory this time, but something deeper. Relief. Hope, the sense that a wound long festering in their town had finally begun to heal. Margaret clutched her son's hand, tears streaking her cheeks. You've given us more than a home, Ethan. You've given us our dignity back. As the sun dipped lower, casting the square in amber light, Ethan stood with Rusty at his side, Holly's hand on his shoulder, Sam's approving gaze steady on him, and even Charles humbled before him. For the first time, Ethan understood. The race had never been about proving the crowd wrong. It had been about proving that broken things, whether horses, families, or hearts, could be made whole again. And in the dust of Willow Creek, with a horse once discarded now standing tall as a champion reborn, the first true step toward redemption had been taken. The weeks after the race carried a different kind of air through Willow Creek. Where once the townsfolk had whispered Ethan's name with scorn, now they spoke it with reverence. Mothers used the story to hush quarrelsome children. Fathers repeated it in saloons with wide gestures, and boys reenacted the finish line sprint in the dusty alleys, pretending their broomsticks were horses and shouting Rusty's name as they flew. A horse once dismissed as worthless had become the town's symbol of resilience, and the boy who believed in him was now its unlikely hero. For Ethan, the change was overwhelming. He woke each morning in the same leaning shack, with the same patched shirt on his back and the same ache in his muscles from endless work. Yet when he walked into town for supplies, strangers tipped their hats, and neighbors who had once sneered now pressed his hand in quiet gratitude. It was as if the race had pulled the veil from their eyes and reminded them that even broken things could shine. Charles Whitmore kept his word. A week after the race, he rode to the Miller shack with a wagon load of supplies and a proposal drawn in ink on fine parchment. Ethan and Margaret would have a house on Whitmore land. No rent, no debts, so long as Ethan agreed to train Rusty and other horses at the ranch. Margaret wept when she read it, not from relief alone, but from the strange tenderness that accompanied forgiveness. She had hated Charles for years, but she could not deny that something in him had shifted. Moving into the ranch's guest house was like stepping into another world. For the first time, Margaret had a kitchen with a stove that didn't smoke and a roof that didn't leak. She set about tending the place with an energy Ethan hadn't seen in years, her shoulders lighter, her laughter freer. For Ethan, the change was more subtle, but no less profound. A stable for Rusty, wide pastures for exercise, and the guidance of Sam Collins, who now spent most of his days on the ranch as a mentor. Holly was never far. She walked the pastures with Ethan, showing him corners of the land her mother had once loved. They worked side by side in the stables, brushing down horses, tending to tack, mixing feed. With every day that passed, the bond between them deepened, woven from shared secrets and quiet glances that lingered longer than either dared admit. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of crimson and gold, Holly stood with Ethan at the fence, watching Rusty graze. The horse's coat shone now, not with the sheen of perfection, but with the health of steady care. His eyes, once clouded with weariness, sparkled with alertness, as if he too had been reborn. "He looks like he belongs here," Holly said softly. Ethan nodded, his voice rough with pride. "He does." Maybe for the first time in years, she turned to him, her gaze lingering. "You've done more than save him, Ethan. You've given this town hope. You've given my father something I thought he'd lost forever." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words, pressing against his chest. "I didn't do it alone. I had your help, and Sam's, and Rusty's faith in me when I didn't even have faith in myself." Holly smiled, the kind of smile that carried both warmth and sorrow. "My mother would have loved you. She would have said you were the kind of soul Storm Dancer was meant to carry." The silence that followed was charged, heavy with the things left unsaid. Ethan wanted to reach for her hand, but the fear of what it might mean kept him still. Yet in her eyes, he saw the same flame he felt burning inside himself, a flame of connection, of belonging, of something new that neither of them had expected. Sam, watching from the porch, puffed on his cigarette and muttered to Margaret, "Looks like the boy found more than a horse." Margaret only smiled, her eyes glistening with pride and a mother's knowing. As the weeks turned into months, the work grew. Ethan began training not just Rusty, but other horses from the ranch, teaching them with the same patience and care that had saved Storm Dancer. Children from town came to watch, wide-eyed, eager to learn. Ethan found himself telling them stories, not of victory, but of perseverance, of nights in the storm, of whispered promises, of faith that refused to die. Slowly, an idea took root in his mind. A program to teach the youth of Willow Creek the skills and values he had learned through Rusty. Not just riding, but respect, patience, and compassion. When he shared the idea with Holly one evening, her face lit with excitement. "That's exactly what this place needs." A school, a safe haven, something that gives the next generation the chance you never had. Charles overheard them, his face shadowed by the fading light. He nodded slowly, a man still awkward in humility but trying. Always trying. "If that's what you want, Ethan, then we'll make it happen. This ranch will be more than land and cattle. It'll be a place of second chances." The words settled deep in Ethan's heart. He knew that second chances were rare, often fragile, but he also knew they were worth everything. He had been given one through Rusty, and now it was his duty to pass it on. That night, as the stars spread across the Texas sky, Ethan stood in the stable beside Rusty. The horse lifted his head, eyes meeting his with the same steady fire as the day they had locked gazes in the square. Ethan pressed his hand against the horse's muzzle and whispered, "We're not done, old friend." "We've just begun," Rusty snorted softly, his breath warm against the boy's palm. And in that moment, Ethan felt the flame of something greater than victory. It was the flame of purpose, of love, of a future built not on pride or power, but on trust and faith. And as the night deepened, Willow Creek seemed to hum with the promise of all that lay ahead, lit by the new flame kindled between a boy, a girl, and a horse who had once been forgotten. Winter crept over Willow Creek in a quiet way, dusting the fields with frost and dimming the golden light that once bathed the hills. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the season not as a hardship, but as a blessing. The guest house on Whitmore land held firm against the cold, its hearth burning bright, and Margaret's laughter could be heard drifting across the yard as she cooked meals that filled the air with warmth. Yet the true heart of the ranch was not the house or the fields. It was the stable, where Rusty lived out his days with a grace that belied his scars. The horse had changed. Not just in body, though his coat gleamed now and his frame filled out with steady meals, but in spirit. He walked with pride, his head held high, his eyes alert with curiosity. Children from town flocked to see him, their giggles echoing as they brushed his mane under Ethan's watchful eye. They touched his old scars with reverence, as though the horse's body told a story of survival more powerful than words. Rusty no longer belonged to one person. He belonged to all of Willow Creek, a living symbol of resilience. Ethan's dream slowly took form. With Charles's backing and Holly's tireless support, they transformed a section of the ranch into a training ground for young riders. What began as a few curious children became a steady group, boys and girls who might never have touched a horse if not for the chance. Ethan taught them what Sam had taught him: patience, respect, and the truth that a horse's heart was stronger than muscle alone. Sam himself became a permanent figure at the ranch, grumbling at the cold but smiling when no one looked, his sharp eyes softened by the sight of a new generation carrying the flame forward. The townsfolk who once mocked Ethan now sent their sons and daughters to learn from him. Men who had placed cruel bets on Rusty's failure came to the fence lines, tipping their hats in apology, humbled by the sight of the old horse guiding their children's hands. The town square buzzed with a new story, not of ridicule, but of redemption. One spring evening, as the sun set in streaks of fire across the sky, Charles stood beside Ethan at the pasture fence. His once proud posture had softened, his face lined not by arrogance, but by reflection. He watched Rusty graze peacefully among the younger horses, his shadow long against the earth. "I never thought I'd see the day," Charles murmured. "That horse, he gave me back my family. He gave me back myself." His voice cracked, and for a moment the mask of the rancher slipped, revealing the widower who had carried grief too heavy to bear. "I used to think strength meant burying the past. But you, boy, you showed me it means carrying it, honoring it." Ethan nodded, his hand resting on the fence rail. "Rusty taught me that. He carries his scars, but he doesn't let them define him. Maybe that's the lesson we all needed." Behind them, Holly approached quietly, her shawl drawn against the evening breeze. She slipped her hand into Ethan's, her smile soft but certain. "Mama would be proud," she said, "not just of Rusty, but of all of us." The three of them stood together in silence, watching the horse who had bridged the chasm between grief and healing. Rusty lifted his head, ears pricking as if he knew he was being spoken of, and trotted toward them with surprising vigor. Ethan reached out, stroking the velvet muzzle, his heart swelling with gratitude. But even as joy filled the air, Ethan noticed the faint stiffness in Rusty's stride, the way his breaths came slower at day's end. Age was catching up. Inevitable and unyielding. The realization pressed heavy on Ethan's chest, but he pushed it aside, determined not to waste the time they still had. Seasons turned. The ranch flourished, the training program grew, and Ethan's bond with Holly deepened into something neither could deny. Yet through it all, Rusty remained at the center, the constant reminder of where it had begun. His presence turned pain into purpose, grief into growth, doubt into faith. When townsfolk spoke of Willow Creek now, they no longer spoke of Whitmore's power or the wealth of the ranches. They spoke of a horse once called useless, and a boy who believed. Rusty's name became a story told by lamplight, a tale of redemption that spread far beyond the town's borders. Travelers came to see him, reporters scribbled notes, and children pointed wide-eyed at the horse who had outrun despair. And though Ethan knew Rusty's years were numbered, he also knew that legacies were not measured in time, but in the lives they touched. Stormdancer had returned not to reclaim a crown, but to pass it on. One night, Ethan sat in the stable long after the ranch had gone quiet. Rusty stood in his stall, half asleep, the lantern's glow flickering over his chestnut coat. Ethan leaned against the wooden rail, whispering into the stillness. "You saved me, old friend. You saved us all. Whatever time we have left, know this. You'll never be forgotten." Rusty lifted his head, eyes meeting Ethan's with the same steady fire as that first day in the square. For a moment, boy and horse simply looked at each other, bound by something deeper than words. Then Rusty exhaled a long, peaceful breath, and Ethan knew with certainty the legacy had already begun. Years passed in Willow Creek, and the ranch transformed into something no one could have imagined in the days when laughter echoed at the thought of Ethan Miller and his broken-down horse. The stables grew fuller, not with racehorses bred for trophies, but with rescues, creatures discarded by others, now given new life. Children ran across the pastures with wide grins, their boots kicking up dust as they learned to ride under Ethan's steady hand. What had begun with a single boy's defiance had blossomed into a movement, one that reached beyond the fences of the Whitmore Ranch. Rusty grew old, his muzzle frosted with gray, his stride slower with each season. Yet his spirit never dimmed. He carried the youngest children on gentle walks around the corral, his patience endless, his presence calming. To them he was not a relic, but a hero, a living story whose eyes told of battles fought and won. Ethan often caught himself watching Rusty with a mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing the years left were few, but refusing to let grief taint the time that remained. On a warm summer afternoon, the ranch hosted a gathering for the community. Families spread blankets across the grass, music drifted from fiddles and guitars, and the air was rich with the scent of barbecued meat and baked bread. At the heart of it all, Ethan stood before a group of eager children, telling them the story they all knew but never tired of hearing. The day Rusty, once mocked as useless, outran the best horses in the county. The children leaned forward, their eyes shining, their small hands clutching toy reins as though they, too, were racing. "And what did we learn that day?" Ethan asked, his voice carrying across the crowd. A boy barely 8 years old shouted back, "That even the broken can be champions." The cheer that followed rippled through the field, laughter and clapping mingling under the open sky. Ethan smiled, his chest swelling with something deeper than pride. This was the seed Rusty had planted. the belief that no matter how scarred, how overlooked, every soul held worth. As the sun dipped low, Ethan walked toward the pasture where Rusty grazed slowly, his tail flicking lazily against the summer flies. Holly joined him, her hand brushing his as naturally as breath, her smile radiant in the fading light. Behind them, Margaret laughed with neighbors, her face unlined by worry for the first time in decades. Charles stood further off, his posture softer than in his younger years, his gaze fixed not on wealth or power, but on the family and community he had once nearly destroyed. Ethan leaned against the fence, watching Rusty lift his head, ears flicking forward. "He's slowing down," Ethan murmured, his throat tight. Holly slipped her arm through his. "He's earned his rest." "But look around, Ethan. His spirit is everywhere. Every child who learns to ride, every horse given a second chance, every heart that dares to believe again." Ethan swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in his eyes. I don't know who I am without him." "You're the boy who believed in him when no one else would," she said softly. "And now you're the man who teaches others to believe. That's who you are, with him and after him." That night, Ethan sat in the stable, lantern light casting warm shadows across the walls. Rusty stood in his stall, eyes half closed, breathing slow and steady. Ethan reached out, resting his forehead against the horse's neck. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, for carrying me when I had nothing, for teaching me that faith is stronger than fear." Rusty shifted, pressing his muzzle gently into Ethan's chest, a gesture they had shared since the first stormy night in the shack. In that touch was every mile they had traveled together, every battle fought, every victory won. Seasons turned once more, and one quiet spring morning, Rusty lay down beneath the oak tree near the pasture, the grass wet with dew, the sky bright with promise. Ethan was there, holding the horse's head in his lap, his tears falling freely as he whispered words of gratitude. Rusty's last breath was calm, a sigh that carried not pain, but peace, as though he knew his work was finished. They buried him beneath the oak, and at its roots the town placed a stone etched with words simple and true: "Rusty, Storm Dancer, the horse who taught us to believe." Years later, Willow Creek still told the story. Children who had never seen Rusty in life spoke his name with reverence, repeating the legend of the broken horse who outran despair. And every time a young rider sat tall on a saddle, every time a neglected horse found a home, Rusty's spirit lived on. One evening, long after the ranch had quieted, Ethan stood with Holly and their children at the oak. Fireflies blinked in the twilight, and the air carried the scent of clover and earth. His youngest tugged at his sleeve, eyes wide. "Daddy, do you think I can be like you someday? Do you think I can save a horse like Rusty?" Ethan knelt, his hand resting gently on the child's shoulder. "You don't have to be like me," he said softly. "You just have to believe. That's where it all begins." The child smiled, and in that smile, Ethan saw the continuation of a story that had started long ago with a gift meant as mockery and ended as a legacy. As the stars rose over Willow Creek, the wind stirred the branches of the oak, whispering through the leaves like a voice carried from another world. Ethan closed his eyes, hearing it not with his ears, but with his heart. the steady, unbroken rhythm of hooves that would never fade. Rusty was gone, but the seed he had planted had grown into something eternal. A seed of belief, carried from one generation to the next, forever reminding them that even in the broken, a champion waits to rise. And that was the incredible journey of Ethan and Rusty. The horse everyone thought was worthless, but who became a legend. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments, so I know you're here with us. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next stories will take you on even more emotional journeys of people and animals whose lives will inspire you forever.